for authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me tonight is John Koerner, and we're going to be discussing his book, Why the CIA Killed John F. Kennedy and Malcolm X. And I believe this has a lot to do with the drug trade. I remember from reading the book, he went into a lot of detail about exactly which deals were going down in this here book, and he can tell you a lot better than I can about it since he wrote it and I just read it. And I got one reading out of it, and I've been out of the hospital, so I've retained what I could of it, but it's a very fascinating reading. If you want to learn more about this, I think this would be a fantastic source, folks, so you want to keep him in mind. So, John, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, Royce. I'm glad you're doing good, too. Good to hear you.
Oh, yeah, thank you, and I do appreciate you working with me when I had server trouble that last time around. I apologize for that, but we're live now, so we're not having no kind of server trouble right now.
Well, that's good. I'm looking forward to a good conversation tonight for everybody about President Kennedy and Malcolm X.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things I was reading in your book was that there were strong connections between Malcolm X and Robert Kennedy, I believe it was, but weaker connections with John F. Kennedy, wasn't there, or something to that effect?
Yeah, a lot of connections all around, really. One that really fascinates me. Let's talk about Dr. King for a minute. I mean, we just finished up with Dr. King Day, and Malcolm X, he seems to have, you might agree, kind of some would say like maybe a negative opinion of him. He seems like he's always connected to black power and anger and violence towards white people, but at the end of his life, Malcolm X really starts to change a lot, and he starts to think about things differently. That white people are not all evil, and they can be worked with and not against. And Dr. King, at the end of his life, he was starting to think about changing things too. And they started to really see eye to eye on a lot of things, one of which was to protest against the Vietnam War and to start advocating more for the needs of the working class. And I'm thinking in the book and talking about in the book that one big issue we have today is, of course, income inequality, and these men really fought for that and really died for it.
But it didn't last once they got it. I mean, I would say when I was younger, there was more equality in pay and stuff, for example, than there is today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's. I was just reading in the paper just yesterday that this year the top 1% of the wealthy in the world are going to own half of the world's wealth in 2015. And it's really never been that big of a disparity, and really in all of really human history, it seems. And we need to think about, I think, how we got to that point. And President Kennedy's assassination, Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy, and Dr. King, these were major advocates for the working class that were eliminated in the 1960s, and their voices silenced. And I think we can trace a lot of that to the deaths of these four men.
I'd like to take a quick moment out to apologize. Somebody has pointed out to me in the chat room that next time I ought to put the microphone on mute before I blow my nose, and it just dawned on me that I've been doing that all day without giving it a thought, and I just went and did it and didn't even think about the mute button, and I apologize for that.
The mistakes happen. It's all organic, Royce. We're doing our best,
But, yeah, I think probably, though, we could probably thank the fact that we didn't have a lot of people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. I'm sorry, I had a brain fart there for a minute. To continue to carry on their torch. I mean, I think you mentioned one of their children. I think it was Martin Luther King's children kind of carried on his torch, but not to the same degree. But what I am saying, if we had had more people like them fighting through the decades, we might have a better shot than what we have right now, in other words.
Yeah, and there could have been I think, really a great combination of events. If Dr. King had lived, I mean, he was trying to start this Poor People's Campaign in 1968 when he was assassinated, and then Robert Kennedy was assassinated 2 months later, And RFK was a big advocate for the poor and the working class as New York State Senator. So if King lives on into the Kennedy administration, they would have been really good advocates for each other, really good partners in trying to help the working class. And just to tie in the CIA into this, Robert Kennedy was convinced that the agency killed his brother. He spent 5 years researching the assassination, and he was convinced that they had killed his brother. And one thing that he wanted to do, if he became president, was to open up a new investigation into the assassination and prove to the world that they killed his brother. And one thing he was going to do is dismantle the agency and hold trials for treason and execute the man who killed his brother. And if you just kind of play this forward in time, the CIA back in that era, they're different today. They do obviously different things today, but back in that era, they were doing a lot of different things that were making nations like Iran hate our country. So you have to wonder if this war on terrorism today would even exist if Robert Kennedy had dismantled the CIA in 1969. You got to wonder how that would play out.
So would you say maybe in your opinion the CIA is becoming a little bit more legit in operation than it was back then?
Yeah, I think there's much more oversight today of the agency, and they've done a lot of, I think, very positive things, like helping the president track down Osama bin Laden, for example. I mean, that was obviously a major coup and really big help to our country. But it seems like, just to quote President Truman, I mean, he in 1964 into 65, he was starting to say that, well, maybe they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing. They're going beyond their original intention and getting involved in what he called strange activities. He, of course, created the CIA in the 1940s, and he thought perhaps that in the 60s they might have been going beyond what they were intended to do. And many researchers have concluded, like I have, that they assassinated President Kennedy, his brother, Malcolm X, and Dr. King. But my twist on it is that one big motivation for it is that the men were all advocates of ending the Vietnam War, and if that happened, then the agency could no longer sell drugs to the American GIs in Vietnam who they were selling drugs to. And many of them, as you might know, they came home addicted to heroin, and about 60,000, and counting, I should add, have killed themselves, in part because of their drug addictions.
Yeah, and a lot of the people you see homeless are veterans who had turned to drugs. Mm-hmm. And you got to really kind of ask yourself, I mean, the going claim that I understand from the government is that this was like due to post-traumatic stress disorder or AKA shell shock, because of the war. But was it really due to that, or was it due to the drugs they were introduced to while they were over there? I mean, what about the people that go over there and serve and come back and go into political office for the rest of their life, and it doesn't affect them like it does the others?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you mentioned the homeless people. I mean, my heart just goes out to them. They serve their country, and many of them were drafted, and then they come home, and the nation just they blame them in some cases for the war that they never should be blamed for, and in many cases, if you think about heroin just for a minute, it is a highly addictive drug, and many of these men, again, not all of them, I mentioned some exceptions, but many of them were fighting a war that was just so difficult to fight. It was so stressful. We talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. So heroin becomes an easy way out to alleviate the stress. And again, it's being sold to them by agents of the CIA and those that they would employ in Vietnam to make a profit. And if the war ever comes to an end, then that drug trade comes to an end. And that's where JFK comes to an end.
So what was the money from the drug trade being used for? Anything in particular?
Well, a number of things. Just to give you some statistics, in terms of what we're talking about here, just taking 1 week, I picked the week the president was killed in November of 1963, just that week, the agency made $97,000 running drugs just from South Vietnam just in South Vietnam. They made almost $100,000 just that week running heroin. And they would use it, again, for their own personal profit, for their families and themselves. They would also use it to create things like gambling casinos to make more money. The agency ran a casino in the Laotian capital city for a number of years, which was in part funded by drug money. And then...
Now, you got documentation on this, right?
Yeah, it's all in the book. A lot of the work comes from really three different sources. One is the work done by Alfred McCoy. He's done a lot of the background work on this, and his archives and work is very essential to understanding what happened. The second thing is recordings that I listened to from the JFK White House. They're available through the JFK Library. And I listened to hours and hours of tapes with the president talking about Laos and the drug trade. And the third thing are a number of different newspapers that did reporting on this, like the New York Times and the Times of London. So that's where most of it comes from.
Okay. It sounds like you went to a lot of trouble to get all this here documented from different sources. You seem to know what you're talking about on this. It was but the thing that I never did figure out was, why would they make the purchase and use of drugs in the United States illegal when they're making a profit off from it?
That's true, yeah. I mean,
that was strange.
Marijuana, right? Yeah. It seems a bit hypocritical, yeah. Well, one thing is, a lot of it, just to mention too, is just so diabolical the way they do this. Many of the American GIs who died in Vietnam, the agency would fill their coffins with heroin to ship them back to the United States for sale in the domestic marketplace. And Malcolm X knew about this. He was preaching in America's ghettos saying that the agency is bringing in drugs and we need to stop this. It's threatening our families. It's destroying them. And in the 1960s, the way they also got help with this was the American Mafia was enlisted to help bring more drugs into the United States. Santos Traficante was one of the major figures that the agency enlisted to help.
Okay. Now, you mentioned, though, that the whole thing really started with John Kennedy. And if I remember correctly, you read reports, or you wrote about reports about how the lone gunman theory could not have worked. Is that correct?
Right. That's a interesting point to bring up. Yeah, I mean, because you have the official version of events that Oswald acted alone, that the Warren Commission concluded that he was the only gunman, and that all the shots that hit President Kennedy had to have come from behind him, that Oswald was shooting from behind. And I think just one easy way to dispel that notion, to prove it completely wrong, is if you could somehow prove that he was being shot from the front, obviously. There'd be a different shooter, couldn't be Oswald, which would prove a conspiracy. So what I put in the book is what I think is the easiest way to prove this. You have two men, Dr. Charles Crenshaw and Dr. Malcolm Perry, who we can point to for this. JFK is taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital in Trauma Room 1, just about 1 o'clock in the afternoon on November 22nd, 1963, and he's laid out there in the gurney. He is just barely alive. So these two men who are the first to see him, they look at the president's throat, and they have seen many gunshot wounds in their day, dozens of them. They're trained forensic pathologists, Malcolm Perry and Charles Crenshaw, and they both identify a precise, small entry wound in the president's throat. And they also see in the back of his neck a larger exit wound. And gunshots are like this. It's very logical, easy to understand. When a bullet enters the body, it enters in a very precise, small way. Then it picks up blood, guts, and mass. and when it exits the body, it creates a larger wound of exit.
Right. They taught this extensively when I was in the Marine Corps in boot camp.
Yeah.
Only with those, we used an M16, which was much, much worse about it because the projectile on an M16 would tumble. So when it exited, the exit hole was like 4 or 5 times larger than an average round that didn't tumble. However,
that's a great point, yeah.
However, still, even on a regular round, it does go in and leave a pinpoint small area at entry, and then, like you say, it picks up all the extras and bone and stuff and whaps out a bigger hole on the way out.
Yeah, so it's very simple to identify this, and they both tell, Perry and Crenshaw, they both said, and they told this to the reporters too, it's in a lot of newspapers at the time that they printed this, they said the president has in his throat a precise entry wound. And that proves, beyond any doubt, really, that he was being shot from the front. And, again, that could not have been Oswald, who was, again, working in the book depository behind him. So just that one basic fact, that entry wound in the throat, that's all you really need. It's checkmate to prove a shot coming from the front. Are you still there, Royce?
Can you hear, John?
I can hear you now.
Okay. My apologies for that. Now, back to where we're at. Was that the only wound, was the one that was in the front, or was there another wound in the back as well? I mean, could there have been more than one shooter?
Oh, yes. There are a number of different wounds on both President Kennedy and on Governor Conley. There's a wound in his back. There's a wound in the neck. There's the headshot, and several other different wounds in Governor Conley as well. And one problem here with the forensics of the case is the weapon, the Carcano Oswald was using. This thing was not easy to fire. He had to recycle the barrel. The scope was defective. And if you time out the shooting based on the Zapruder film, where the president first reacts to being shot, if you line that up with where the assassin was allegedly shooting from, it would have been through a tree. So it would be through heavy foliage for that first shot. So it doesn't make any sense. The shooters would have been in different locations, and it seems as if Oswald was deliberately set up as a patsy, as he said himself, to take the fall for the shooting.
Well, it sounds to me like they didn't want anybody to know for sure where the actual kill shot came from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems as if there probably was a shooter on the grassy knoll from the front that took care of the throat wound and the headshot. And then another shooter perhaps in the book depository, and another one in the Dale Tex building, so they could take him out. It seems like they wanted to make sure he didn't get out alive. They wanted to take out his voice, his head, his lungs, everything that there would be no way he could escape that alive.
Well, make sure if he was alive, he couldn't talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a systematic execution. And even the headshot, I'm sure we've all seen the Zapruder film. That's not a typical headshot. The president's brain is ripped off the side of his head. It seems as if there was some kind of artillery used to explode on impact that may, in fact, be only available to the CIA. A civilian would not likely have that kind of artillery to use. And, in fact, mercury would be that type of thing you could use to explode on impact. And it seems as if possibly that would have been used, again, by the agency.
Something that wouldn't take a huge impact, but yet would have a big punch to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just the forensics of the case, they just don't seem to add up. And I think it just, again, proves pretty easily to a conspiracy. In fact, people even there who were witnessing the assassination, many of them even saw or heard someone shooting from the front of the president. So it's just, the Warren Commission is just, it's a complete fiction, really.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of confusion was going on at the time it went down. And why were they shooting? Who was the other guy you said was with them? I forget his name now.
Governor Conley.
Governor Conley.
Conley, yeah.
Why would they want to get him out of the picture? Or was he just fodder?
I think that he just ends up being kind of like collateral damage. He survived the assassination. It seems like he's only really there for political reasons.
Well, I know that if the average person on the street wanted to assassinate a president, like you say, they're not likely to have anything any fancier than what you can buy on the street, unless they're also in the military in some sort of position, maybe home on leave or something.
Right. And the people that were there, a lot of them felt that the gunfire was almost like a machine gun fire, that the shots were happening so rapidly, and there are so many wounds on Governor Conley and President Kennedy that, again, a Koerner cannot be recycled that quickly. You have to pull the trigger and then pull the barrel down and back and pull the trigger again, aim and shoot. It takes a long time to do this, and sometimes it was had through heavy foliage, so it would not be really possible for that gun to create.
Had to be a semi-automatic.
Yeah, it sounded like a semi-automatic, because we most likely had there that day 3 teams of assassins, one in the book depository, one in the Dale Tex building, and one on the grassy knoll, to create 3 teams of gunfire to make sure the president never got out alive.
Okay. And out of all of this, was they able to tell which one was the shot that killed?
The headshot would be the kill shot, again, coming from the front. And then, I was looking into some of the research behind this, and E. Howard Hunt, he was a member of the CIA from almost the very beginning. And just before he dies, just a few years ago, in fact, he calls his son St. John to his bed, and he says it's time to talk about some of the secrets he's been holding throughout his entire life. And he just spills his guts. He said, get a tape recorder out, get a notepad out, and he names a number of different men who were involved in the conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy, and even he names himself, too. And he talks about how it was planned, who the assassin was in the grassy knoll. And he also names a man named David Morales that I think is interesting, because David Morales, as I talk about in the book, he is a key member of the drug trade in Laos. The agency appointed him to operate on the ground in Laos, the drug trade. And he also was pinned as one of the assassins for Robert Kennedy, too.
Okay, so we did have one of the shooters that was confessing there was more than one.
Yeah, according to E. Howard Hunt, yeah, there's even some speculation he may have even been in Dallas that day as one of the famous 3 tramps that were photographed by a Dallas newspaper photographer that were hiding in a railroad car. And he may have been one of these men. It looks a lot like him anyway in the photographs. And this man, E. Howard Hunt, just before he dies, he names a number of names, says Johnson was involved, and pins a number of key men in the agency in real high command that wanted the president dead. And I think the most interesting is this man, David Morales, who I think we can connect to the other assassinations, too.
So could it be that more than one person wanted him dead from the same agency, and nobody compared notes, and everybody just went off on their own, figured that other people would have deniability if they, kept it to themselves, and since nobody knew what nobody was doing, it just all gathered together at one place?
That is very plausible, because bring up a parallel comparison, William Pepper did a great book about the Dr. King assassination called Execution of State, and he concluded after years of research that on April 4th, 1968, when King was killed, there were 2 teams of assassins there to kill Dr. King, and neither knew that the other one was there. So you make a good point there that so many people wanted the president dead, and King as well, that's quite possible, yeah.
Okay, now how many people wanted Robert Kennedy and Malcolm X dead? Was this another similar situation with all of them?
Yeah, Robert Kennedy is interesting to talk about for a minute. I mean, he's, again, I think a very courageous man. He tells his mother, by the way, he's going to run for president. And she basically says, you know, they're going to kill you, right? So it's just such a courageous run for the presidency in '68, and he makes it very clear when he runs for president. He wants the Vietnam War to come to an end, wants the drug trade in Laos to come to an end, and he wants to investigate his brother's assassination. So he is the biggest threat that they've had in their whole history. Because if he becomes president, then the truth comes out about JFK, and the agency is going to be held accountable for this. It might no longer exist. And the drug trade is going to go away, too. So he's got to be killed. And I mentioned before, this is so tragic, because if he is allowed to become president, then I think we can play out history into the 60s and 70s and say that there is no war on terrorism and no income inequality today. So it's just a devastating assassination for Robert Kennedy when he gets killed in June of 1968.
Yeah, what about the wars today, if you don't mind me coming out of your book for just a minute?
No, that's fine.
Do you think that maybe drugs and drug trade could be at the root of the wars in, you know, Pakistan and wherever, Afghanistan, the Middle East, I guess that you call it?
I think it's worth looking into, yeah. I think a lot of us know that Afghanistan now is now taken the number one position in terms of where opium comes from today. Really, that's where most.
Funny you used to say that. I was just thinking that opium is a big business, and it's one of the most powerful drugs out there.
It really is. I mean, it gives us heroin, morphine, codeine. I mean, it's a very lucrative business. And again, the two places on earth that it's grown are the two places that we've been at war the most in the past half a century. I mean, is that just a coincidence? No, probably not.
Well, I can't help but wonder, because it seems to me like there's been like a very close to a non-stop stream of war from back during Kennedy's day up to today with somebody or the other. If that could have been a drug trade behind the whole thing all throughout history.
Yeah. I mean, drugs are so prevalent in society. It's just, they're so damaging to people's lives. They're so pervasive. And it's just, especially heroin. I mean, we talk to people that get addicted to heroin. It just is almost impossible to kick. And you get that first taste, and from what I've heard, I've never done heroin, but I've done some research on it, and it just, and you talk about these men who fight in war. I mean, they look for ways to alleviate their PTSD, and drugs are a way to do this. And to just take advantage of these men in that way, it just is so disrespectful to their service to their country. And my family is actually a military family. My father served during the Cold War. My grandfather was in World War II. My brother-in-laws were all in the military. So, you know, we've experienced, you know, from friends in the family and information that we've gotten, and it just destroys people's lives.
But it didn't destroy your family's life.
Fortunately not. My father was able to avoid the Vietnam War. He was assigned instead to fight the Cold War in Germany for a number of years in the Army. But fortunately, the USSR never invaded Western Europe. But if they did, he'd have been right there in the forefront of it. But yeah, it's certainly a time in our country's history when, as you're saying, drugs start coming into our country, and they've just really never left.
No, I don't think they ever really did, to be honest with you. But, you know, and I look out on the street, see so many homeless people, so many of them that you could tell they were drawing from drugs at a glance. And, you know, I can't help but wonder why it is some of them, they come back and they become archaeologists, they become scientists, they become senators, presidents, generals, other ones harmless and homeless and on the streets. And you got to ask yourself, what's the differing factor? You know, why some of them and not others? And, you know, if these guys are over there seeing horrors upon horrors, their best friends in the whole world, head blowing off right in front of them, and they're scared for their own life. They're afraid it's going to happen to them next. Yeah, I can see, you know, if somebody makes it readily available, you get yourself addicted to it, and then you come home and you're stuck. You can't go nowhere.
Yeah, you got nowhere to turn, and no one wants to help. But you're right. We've had so many of our leadership, Secretary of State John Kerry, Vietnam War veteran, John McCain, another Vietnam War veteran. So, you know, these men, like you're saying, in our leadership, very prominent people in the country's leadership. You know, they served their country in Vietnam, and Vietnam had often been like a litmus test for a number of years if you served or avoided the draft, like with President Clinton or President Bush. So, you know, it's really affected our politics in a number of different ways since the war ended.
I'm just guessing, and I could be wrong, that a lot of the people that weren't affected by drugs were officers. They were not your infantry, your
right,
you know, privates, lance corporals, what have you, and that may be part of the reason why they had never had a need to turn to drugs.
Yeah, that's a good point. They will not experience a lot of the
horrors.
Right, distressful situations that the infantry would be more exposed to. And these type of men, the officer corps, they would probably be, just in general, more predisposed to be able to run for office because they would come from more wealthy families, perhaps, and they would have a platform to run for office because, again, it's so expensive to run a political campaign. They have more the connections, and that might account for the fact that they, like you're saying, they become leadership and avoid the drug aspect to it.
Well, we do know that certain officers, they go straight from college to, what's it called, West Point, somewhere like that, and they're groomed just to lead the forces, in other words, not to actual combat. And, you know, I think that makes a big difference.
Right, and it sure does, yeah. West Point, the Virginia Military Academy, I mean, these are places that they groom the officer corps for all the future wars, yeah.
Now, you know, a lot of people would tell you without reading your book that the reason why Kennedy and King and Malcolm X, all of them were killed was behind their political views. They were, you know, protesting for peace or, you know, lobbying for peace. And there were people that didn't want peace that wanted to bump them off. But you got to stop and ask yourself, I mean, because you got people that do that every day. They call them preachers. Nobody tries to bump off Ed Young or, you know, Joel Osteen, for example.
Right. So the thing to think about there is, the Vietnam War was making so much money for the military-industrial complex, and those that stood in its way would basically end this big cash cow that was being created for their benefit. So if that ever comes to an end, then that money flowing into defense contractors and corporate America comes to an end. But again, it's not only that. The war is necessary to convince the public that the CIA is necessary. There needs to be some kind of war on communism to justify their existence. Otherwise, they would be dismantled because they're an agency that operates overseas. So there needs to be some kind of overseas threat that they're going to create, if it's true or not, to keep themselves active.
So false flag operations are the order of the day, you would think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the drugs play into this, too, because if the war goes away, then they don't have 500,000 potential customers to sell heroin to in Vietnam. Or, like with JFK's administration, the agency was pushing him to invade Laos as well, to have two wars, one in Laos, one in Vietnam. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff said if we're going to go to war in Laos, we'll need 60,000 men to fight that war, which would be, again, 60,000 more customers to sell heroin to. So it's about peace, but it's also about drugs.
Has anybody ever taken the time to look at the higher echelons of the CIA and see who's up at the top that stands to gain the most?
You mean at that time or now?
That time or now, either one. I mean, is it possible that there would be a family like the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds that's been in a high enough up position to stand to gain through all these years?
Yeah, a lot of the men who operate in the CIA at that point in time, and also we should mention that are on the executive boards of the defense contractors, come from the wealthiest families in the United States. So yeah, it really plays right into what you're saying. And a lot of this wealth that's created, I mean, this is where that income inequality really starts. So much of this wealth that was created, that it exists today, it starts with the drug trade. Because there's so much money to be made off of this. Because so many people will use heroin, morphine, codeine, opium, and all these different things all throughout the world. They're highly addictive, highly available, and highly effective.
Now there was something else I was thinking about a minute ago about Lee Harvey Oswald. Mm-hmm. Have you done any, because I don't remember reading about it, extensively in your book, any research into him to see if there was any reason to suspect him to want to kill Kennedy, or anything that would say just the opposite? He had no reason whatsoever, and to suspect him was ludicrous because he had no motive? Or, I mean, is there anything that could speak on his behalf or against him?
Well, most people, there's a lot of different research on Oswald that I read about. One theory is that there were two Oswalds.
That's an interesting concept.
Yeah. There's one man, they both have the same name, but one man who lived in Dallas, also in New Orleans for a while too, a civilian that was used as a fall guy for this. And this other Oswald worked for the CIA, was trained by them in foreign intelligence operations, and he was a different man entirely than the one who was blamed for the assassination. So there's that theory. There's this other theory that, again, there was just one Oswald who was a member of the CIA from a very young age, in his teenage years, sent to Russia to spy there. He came back to our country. He spent some time in Japan, had a military air base there where U-2 spy planes originated for flights over Russia. So he spends a lot of different time working in the agency, doing different sorts of intelligence operations. So it's not really clear who he really was. He insisted he was innocent, and it seems like he probably was. And just basic thing we can mention, just going back to the crime scene at the Texas Schoolbook Depository.
I'm sorry, pardon me to interrupt you, but you got a call coming in. I don't want it to hang up on you.
Okay.
Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. I was just wondering if your guest had studied or researched or looked into the connections between LBJ and Brown and Root. As I understand it, Brown and Root got pretty wealthy off of construction contracts in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and they were one of the biggest financiers of LBJ. And from what I've gathered from most people that were alive during that period of time, like they'd be old people now, senior citizens, but every single one of them almost says the same thing about the JFK assassination in the exact same words. They all say LBJ did it. And I was wondering if he'd ever looked into the LBJ, Brown and Root and, aspect of it all. Anyway, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for calling in, Annan.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, there's a number of things I can add to that, certainly. One thing is, going back to E. Howard Hunt, he, again, this man from the agency, he admits on his deathbed that he, of course, knew that LBJ was involved with this and was aware of it. And the CIA and the military, they both knew that Lyndon Johnson would be much more amenable to expanding the war in Vietnam, which he did, and covert operations in Laos, because they had talked to him about this before the president had died. So there's that to it. There's also a number of other things we can mention, too, about Lyndon Johnson. Looking at investigations conducted into his activities with defense contractors, you might know that the Congress was investigating this. They're investigating Vice President Johnson's military connections to different defense contractors in Texas, and that he was doing a number of illegal things with them. And the Congress was holding hearings about this. Never guess when, November 1963. So these investigations were just starting to begin in the month that President Kennedy was assassinated. And one thing that Lyndon Johnson did once he became president was he shut down these investigations in the subcommittees of the Congress, so they can no longer look into this when he became president. So what the man's saying is pretty frightening and pretty true. And by the way, this new movie Selma talks about Lyndon Johnson's role in the civil rights movement. He does not come across too well, and he is depicted as a reluctant advocate of civil rights in this new movie that has just recently come out about Dr. King.
Okay. That sounds pretty interesting, but I was going to mention we got 20 minutes left, and I don't want to get too far out there and not give you the opportunity to mention things that I didn't think to ask you. I always like to, about 15, 20 minutes before a show ends, give my guests a few minutes to, share anything that they want to share about their work that I didn't think to ask.
Well, if you want to look at my research in my books, I do a ghost walk company in the Buffalo area. It's called paranormalwalks.com, paranormalwalks.com. The Paranormal Walks website has links to all my books. And this book about, why the CIA killed JFK and Malcolm X, you can get that on Amazon, but you can also get it at a site called dogearedbooks.com. It's a bit discounted there. It's a good website to support. Again, it's called dogearedbooks.com. You can get the JFK book there if you'd like.
Okay, that sounds like a winner. And also, I got his link up on the page here at www.paranormalwalks.com, but I will be taking it down to put up the next show soon. But I will be moving it to YouTube, probably, I would imagine, tomorrow, more than likely. And I'll have the link in the description in the show, the whole thing, over there in video format. If y'all want to click on it, listen to it. You're not going to be able to get to the book through YouTube. They don't let me put ads over there for that. But I'm working on getting a page up for, people's books after they move. I mean, I got a link to the book now, but when I move it for the next show, it'll go down until I get another page. I had to recently take my site down, so I'm coming up with a new site and kind of in the process of making here. So in the meantime, y'all can go to his site, paranormalwalks.com, or you can go straight to amazon.com and purchase his book there. And you got some other books out, don't you, John?
Oh, yeah, I have a book about the McKinley assassination conspiracy. I have another one, actually two about it, a man named Father Nelson Baker. He's up for sainthood in the Catholic Church, and that book is about some of the miracles that he performed during his life. And that's the kind of a book that approaches miracles not from the standpoint of faith, but trying to look into them and prove them through science and evidence and facts, and disprove some, prove others. It's more of an investigation, kind of like a miracle hunting book.
Okay. So you've got a keen interest in miracles.
Yeah, it's kind of where I started my interest in the paranormal, and it's kind of expanded from there. And I think conspiracies are part of the paranormal because they're not accepted by the mainstream historians. And I think I think it's kind of disrespectful just to kind of discount conspiracies. I mean, if you look at conspiracies in general, all they really are people working together. And all throughout history, that's what we tend to do as people. We tend to work together to do any number of things. So conspiracies, I don't think, should be all that unusual.
Well, it sounds to me a lot like listening to you tonight that not only are they disrespecting a certain field, but they're doing a half a job. I mean, why was one certain story accepted and publicized and nothing about all the other gunshot wounds? And why was it considered a closed case when it sounds far from closed?
It's a great question. And perhaps as time goes on, people will start to become more involved, and they'll be more willing to accept the truth. And a lot of my students that I teach, they are quite open to this. They seem open-minded, I guess, to it. I don't know what it is, but maybe in the future it'll be a different story. But one other thing to think about, too, is many people are often scared of the truth because they have died talking about it. We have a number of witnesses to the Kennedy assassination that were killed, and that might be part of it, too.
I was unaware of that. I'm taking it these witnesses, they were not exactly for Oswald. They were, they were not exactly against him. They were probably on his side.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Lee Bowers, he was a man who was operating a railroad yard behind the grassy knoll, and he actually saw someone shooting from behind the fence there at President Kennedy, and he died mysteriously in a car accident just a few weeks after he testified to the Warren Commission about that. So, and there's I mentioned Nina Rhodes Hughes. She came forward 2 years ago, and she was witness to the Robert Kennedy assassination. She was at the assassination of RFK, and she saw another gunman shooting that wasn't Sirhan, the second gunman, and she kept quiet about this for decades because she felt that if she said anything, she'd be killed.
Then she came out and said something, and she was killed.
Right. Well, so far she's still with us.
Well, guess what, lady? You were right.
Yeah, she was right. And we can also mention even the assassin, Sirhan, the assassin for Robert Kennedy. He's still alive today, and he also admitted 2 years ago that he was trained by the CIA. He admitted it himself. He said he was brainwashed by them, and they said he would kill his family if he didn't do it. So even the assassin himself has said it, and I would guarantee that never makes any history books for the next 50 years. No one's going to mention that. That even the assassin himself has said that the agency planned it.
Well, a lot of people also, they don't want to go down being with a reputation of being a kook, because a lot of conspiracy theorists have, well, I mean, it's like the UFO field or ghost field or any other field. You got a group out there that gives them a bad name.
Yeah, I mean, because some conspiracies obviously are just nonsensical, but you can't lump them all together and just say they're all, without merit, like you're saying. That's
stereotyping, and people are bad about doing it, although it's not really good advice. It's no recipe for finding out what really happened if something did happen other than what you were told.
Yeah, it closes you off to being open to new experiences. You got to keep your mind open in this world to evolve and consider new ideas and facts. And if you don't do that, you never can evolve as a person. And I think Malcolm X was like that. I mean, he starts off as a pimp and a drug dealer, ends up as an enlightened world leader. I mean, it's just no better example than him.
Okay, so a drug dealer went on to fight a war against drugs himself.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. I mean, it's just ironic that is. And next month, in fact, 1 month from today, we're going to mark 50 years since he was assassinated. And I just want people to understand, a lot of the coverage I will expect is going to be quite negative against him. And we need to understand that the man was evolving towards peace, anti-drug, a coalition with Dr. King. He truly had become a really good man and a good father and a good husband. And I really hope that when we get to the coverage of the assassination, that will be at least mentioned somehow for him.
All right. Now, real quick, do you have any events coming up, book signings, new books you're writing, radio shows you're going to be on, or anything like that?
Yeah, two quick. I can mention two things. I'll be on Rick's Conspiracy Show this Sunday night.
Did you say Richard Sirrett?
Yes.
In Canada.
Yes, in Canada.
Yeah, he's been on my show before. He's been a guest.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll be on his show Sunday night at 11. I'll be on the Jim Bohannon show on Friday night, February 20th, the day before the assassination anniversary. That's also at 11. And that's all I've got lined up so far. And if anybody wants to contact me, the website has a contact information. I'd love to do other interviews, whatever people have questions. I'd love to talk to anybody. If you have anything to contribute, I'd love to hear it. In fact, I've actually heard from many veterans since I've been on the air and things, and they've been saying, yes, they were part of the drug trade, and they know what was going on, and they feel, that what I'm saying really is right on the money.
That's kind of interesting, because I went to the VA today to see my lung doctor, and there was a guy that come up to me and kept repeating himself about he doesn't want money, but he wants to know if I can get him something to eat. And, well, he got on my nerves about the third time he said he didn't want money. I bet his head off says, I heard you the first time.
Right.
But I bought him some chicken and some onion rings. But the more I looked at him while he was waiting for my wife to go through the line, I began to realize how he looked like a cleaned up homeless person that might have even once been on drugs. And I got to talking to him, trying to find out he was on some kind of a work program. So I got to now after talking to you, I got to thinking, should I have asked him some questions while I had him there?
Yeah, I mean, the veterans are such a great resource for, what happened, on the ground in Vietnam, and, how it all operated, what they saw firsthand.
I know this guy, he looked to be about roughly in his 50s somewhere. Well, how old would a veteran from Vietnam be, you think?
Yeah, they'd be in their 60s now, 50s, 60s, 70s.
Huh. So that was during the 60s then?
Yeah, the last men out of Vietnam were in 1975. So, we're talking like...
It was right before I went in.
40 years ago the war ended?
Yeah, because I went in 1980.
Okay, so...
79 to 80, yeah, somewhere in there.
I guess if you went into Vietnam in 1970 and, say you were, say 20 years old, that'd make you in your 60s now, I guess.
Well, I don't think this guy was quite 60 unless he carried his age rather well.
Yeah, well, he could be younger. I mean, he could be 18, get drafted like 1970-something. That might work out. He might look young for his age, who knows?
That very well could be.
Or he could, in fact, be in his 60s, yeah.
I'm beginning to wish I had asked him some questions about it. Now, we got like 7 minutes left. Did you have any last-minute thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I wanted to mention, too, is kind of the money aspect to this. I did some, some calculations about the cost of the Vietnam War in terms of the real money that was spent on it. And I came to the conclusion, after the research that I did, that about $1 trillion was spent on the Vietnam War. $1 trillion.
That's a lot of moolah.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. And, again, that's all on that one war. And if you could just imagine that money, if it wasn't spent on the war, I mean, what it could have been spent on. And I did some calculations that if you just take the people living in poverty in the United States, and the war ended in 1975, that those group of people, you could end poverty with that money. You could give each of those families a check for $150,000 if you wanted to. So it is just, the war was so costly to the United States. Financially is one way to measure it. We talked about the deaths from the war, the heroin addiction, but there's also the financial cost to it too. And when we talk about income inequality, when we talk about the war on terrorism, I don't hear anybody mention ever, how did we get here? What were the historical events that led us to this point? And unless we really start thinking about these things, I don't think we can really understand how we got here and how we can change it.
I think most people are kind of like I was when I was in high school, found history to be one of the most boring subjects of all, and concentrated heavy on math and spelling and English, and kind of just skated by on history.
Right. Well, when I teach my classes, I try to emphasize a couple different things. One is our local history from the Buffalo area, and the other, because I think it's important to be proud of where we come from. And then the second thing is try to figure out, how things could be different if certain events could have gone differently, and how we got to this point where we are today. And I think that kind of makes it a little more compelling, almost as if history is a bunch of accidents and mistakes, and it's not like it's one fated event that could happen. It's almost as if history is organic and changing, and things could be different if one
little pieces of a puzzle falling into place.
Right. That's kind of a good way to look at it. And I'm very proud of our country, but we have a great country, and we love our freedoms, and I just, one way to express our democracy and freedoms is to speak truly about our nation's past.
Okay. Well, I show we got like 3 minutes left, and I got to tell you, it's been an interesting conversation. I was kind of hoping that you'll come back with some future books and share your information with the other people out here again.
Yeah, I've got some other things in the noodle that are percolating. Some other projects I'm working on. I'm thinking of doing another religious book. Might go back to that part, because I started writing about...
That's what I was going to mention.
Yeah.
For somebody that thought history was boring, I thought prehistory, back in the days of Noah and the ancient Israelites, was fascinating, and the Sumerians and Egyptians and their religions, but some odd reason could not get involved in political history of our times.
Yeah, and I've always felt that religion should be taught with history. I mean, it seems to be like we're so scared to talk about God in our school system. And I don't want to talk about God to convince people to believe in God. I want people to recognize that people throughout history believed in God, that it was part of their lives, and they needed God, and it played such a role in how history plays out. So
you're not here to proselytize. You're here to, share what its role played was.
Yeah, help people. And even Lincoln, for example. Lincoln believed that the Civil War was divine punishment for slavery, and this is a major theme of his second inaugural address. That because of that, he felt that there was no longer a need to punish the South in the post-war era. So he felt that because God punished us already, let's move on to have malice towards none. And that's an interesting argument. I don't know if it's true or not, but Lincoln believed in this thing, and to leave those kind of things out, I think it doesn't give us the whole story about how history plays out.
Well, he was against slavery, but yet he owned a few.
Well, his family, the Todd family that he marries into, they had slaves. I mean, and even in the North, a number of states that fought for the Union had slaves, that he allowed to have slaves. Kansas, for example, had slavery. Maryland fought for the Union, they had slaves. I mean, it's just a very complicated war. And, obviously, when we get to April, we're going to mark 150 years since it ended. So all this stuff really is very timely and very compelling.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and call this one here. a night. I got a wife waiting on me to join her, and I got to get up tomorrow and start making preps for my next show. Actually, my next show is going to be tomorrow. So, folks, real quick, tomorrow you go to www.freedomslips.com and you click on the chat room up at the very top. Now, I have scheduled a spiritual trap with Edward Alexander. However, I've lost contact with him. And if I'm unable to reach him, I'm also working on replacing him with Laser Les, talking about ancient astronauts. So I should, hopefully between the two of them, come up with one guest anyway. So you guys wish me luck. It'll be www.freedomslips.com. Click on the chat room at the top, and then it'll load a page. It'll ask you to pick a background for the chat room. Then it'll ask you to choose a name.